Welcome to the second part of tutorial key point video 4 for W200. EU law. We looked at the types of legislation. Primary legislation, the one from which all other legislation and the acts of the institutions gain their authority. And primary legislation in the EU are the treaties, and the two key ones are the TEU and the TFEU. The Treaty on the European Union and the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. It is the latter which is most important, and most references that you'll come across to articles such and such are articles such and such in the TFEU. Now, you've got a book that's been sent to you by the Open University on legislation. Do make sure that that is a well-thumbed book, because the treaties, much more than any document in the British system, is key to EU law. So that's primary legislation. Secondary legislation, 5 are defined, but only 2 are ones that you really need to concentrate on. One is regulations, and the other are directives. Look at the definition in the treaty. You'll find it, Article 288, and make sure that you understand those definitions. And I'm not a great fan of memorizing things, but it's key that you know those terms and are able to repeat them. We moved on from there to look at types of action, the direct actions against member states, and there we're talking about articles 258 and 259. Do look at these, make some flow diagrams of what the various steps are. Now, when you're making a flow diagram, you will actually have to sort of do it backwards because of the way that it's written, but come up with flow diagrams for those. Also, a few articles further on, you'll see there's an action against institutions for exceeding their powers or misusing their powers. Again, very important direct action. But the thing that you most need to concentrate on is the reference procedure, sometimes known as preliminary rulings, in Article 267. Again, look at that in detail, look at when it applies and in what sort of circumstances, and certainly read around it. Then we moved on to perhaps the most important topic, direct effect, indirect effect, and state liability, under the heading of enforcing individuals' rights. It's something which regularly, and I mean very, very often, comes up in the exams. So do have a look at the flow diagram that I've sent to you. Make sure that you are completely familiar with it and are able to apply it, because over the years I've been looking at the exam papers, and this is getting on now for a quarter of a century. That flow diagram, followed logically, will answer any problem question about how you enforce individuals' rights, where the right arises in European law. And that's what direct effect is about. It's about being able to go to your national court, your local court even, the local Crown Court, the local county court, even the magistrates' courts, and getting them to give effect to a right which arises in European law. And for a right to have that criteria of direct effect, certain things have to be present. And whether the right arises in a treaty article, a regulation, or a directive, it must meet the Van Gend. It looks as if it's spelt Van Gend. That's how it's spelt. Well, I can't pronounce it properly. It's a Dutch name, Van Gend, I believe. Those criteria: clear, precise, unconditional. If it hasn't got that, can't have direct effect. If it arises in treaty article or a regulation, then that is sufficient. But with directive, 2 additional criteria are needed. Has the date of the implementation passed? That's very straightforward. That either it has or it hasn't. If it has, there is direct effect. If there hasn't, there isn't. And then the most important one, is it an emanation of the state? you must read Foster and British Gas on this topic, read the case itself, read the commentaries on it in the textbooks. That's direct effect. If, having looked at a problem question, you can say, well, it's in a directive, it's past, clear, precise and conditional, the date of implementation is past, but either it doesn't meet the emanation of the state criteria or it might not, then perhaps you can consider going on to indirect effect. This is about the local court looking at the national legislation and seeing whether the national legislation can be interpreted to give effect to the right. So look at the British or whichever country the question relates to and say, can you read that legislation to give effect? That may be possible, but if you have to do violence to the language, add the words not or change one number for another number, then that won't work. So if direct effect, indirect effect are of no use, then you need to consider taking an action not against the body that did you the original harm, but against the state itself. In effect, a tort for the state's failure to implement the right. So-called Frankovich principles, it has to involve, firstly, a right being given to individuals. Secondly, it has to be a sufficiently serious breach. Now, if the directive hasn't been implemented at all, that in itself is sufficiently serious. If it's been improperly implemented, then you've got to consider about the impact and the seriousness of the state's inability, refusal to implement it. And thirdly, the loss has to be the result of the state's failure to implement. We moved then into the single market, and I discussed the concepts of free trade area, customs union, common market and European Union. You'll read about these in your manuals. Just make sure that you understand the key concepts there. And finally, we looked at TMA 03, and what I stressed here was the importance of doing a thorough internet research trail, not because I'm going to be giving lots of marks to it, but because, one, if you do make an error in your research, I can trace it and I can at least credit you for having done it, whereas if it's just the wrong answer, I can't do anything. But also, so that one, you've got a record should you need to come back to this as part of your revision, and secondly, because you can see how effective your search strategy is, and that's the real value of these things. You can see where you've looked, which database you've used, what search terms you've used, and which ones have been useful, which ones haven't been very useful. So learn by it. This is what doing a law degree is about. It's actually reflecting on your learning and reflecting on what you're doing. And the search thing allows you to do that. But of course, you've got to get the answers right. And here I stress the importance of looking exactly at the question. Look at the words that they're asking for and make sure that you, in your answers, are providing those. So carefully interpret the question. With that, I thank you and look forward to the next tutorial. Bye.